Mark Thompson had always thought of himself as a man of solid values, a hardworking father and husband who believed in loyalty, honesty, and trust. At 42 years old, he had spent the last 2 decades building a life with his wife, Linda, in a small, picturesque town just outside of Seattle. Life was comfortable. Mark worked as an architect at a well-known firm, and Linda was a freelance graphic designer. Together, they had raised 2 children, Emma and Jake, who were now 18 and 16, respectively. Emma was preparing for her first year of college, and Jake was starting his junior year of high school. On the outside, the Thompson family appeared to be the perfect picture of suburban happiness, or so Mark had thought. Mark was the kind of man who found contentment in routine. Every morning, he brewed coffee, kissed Linda on the forehead, and dropped Jake off at school. In the evenings, they gather around the dinner table and talk about their day, planning the next family vacation, or discussing Emma's college choices. Life felt predictable in a way that Mark had come to appreciate. After all, what more could a man want than a loving family, a stable career, and a home filled with laughter? But as he was about to discover, life has a way of tearing down even the most carefully built foundations. Linda Thompson, at 40, was still strikingly beautiful with soft auburn hair and a warm smile that had first drawn Mark to her when they met in college. She had always been the creative one, the dreamer to his pragmatism. While Mark found comfort in structure, Linda preferred spontaneity. Her work as a graphic designer allowed her to express that part of herself, and though Mark admired it, he often struggled to understand her free spirit. Despite this difference, they had managed to build a life together, or at least that's what Mark had believed. Their children had been the glue that held their relationship together during tougher times. Emma, with her mother's fiery red hair and her father's sharp intellect, was a natural leader. She excelled in academics, always aiming for the top, and had dreams of becoming a doctor. Jake, on the other hand, was more laid back, more like his mother in temperament. He loved sports and was content with passing grades as long as it allowed him to spend time on the basketball court. To Mark, his kids were the pride and joy of his life. He had always believed that raising them with integrity, providing a stable home, and showing them unconditional love would be enough to keep the family strong. But the cracks in that seemingly perfect life began to appear one evening when Mark received a message that would change everything. It was a Friday night, and Mark had just finished a long week at work. Linda was out with friends, something she had started doing more frequently in the past year. He didn't think much of it. After 2 decades together, he trusted her completely. He sat in his home office, nursing a glass of whiskey and absent-mindedly scrolling through emails when his phone buzzed with a notification. At first, Mark thought it was spam, a message from an unknown number with the subject line, "Do you really know who your wife is?" He almost deleted it, but something about the wording caught his attention. Curious, he opened the message. The text was brief and to the point. Your wife had an affair. Ask her who the real father of your kids is. Mark felt a sudden chill run down his spine. His initial reaction was disbelief. This had to be some kind of prank, a sick joke meant to stir trouble. But as the seconds ticked by, a dark seed of doubt began to take root in his mind. Could it be possible? Could Linda, the woman he had loved for over 20 years, really have betrayed him? He stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing the possibilities. Maybe someone was trying to hurt their family. Maybe this was a lie. But what if it wasn't? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and before he knew it, he was pacing the living room, his heart pounding in his chest. By the time Linda returned home later that night, Mark had convinced himself that the message was nothing but malicious gossip. He didn't bring it up immediately, deciding to let it go, at least for the moment. But over the next few weeks, he noticed things that he had once overlooked. Linda's sudden interest in going out more often, the long phone calls with her friends that ended abruptly when he walked into the room, and the distance between them that he had once attributed to the natural ebb and flow of marriage. These signs, which had seemed so innocent before, now screamed of something more sinister. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Unable to shake the growing suspicion, Mark began digging deeper. He searched through old text messages, emails, and even her social media accounts, something he had never felt the need to do before. But there was nothing. No obvious signs of infidelity, no incriminating messages or suspicious activity. Still, that nagging doubt remained, a whisper in the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. It wasn't until Mark came across an old photo album buried deep in the closet that the first real clue emerged. Flipping through pictures of family vacations and birthdays, he stopped at a photo of the family barbecue from about 15 years ago. There, standing next to Linda, was Bob, Mark's best friend since college. Bob had been like a brother to Mark, and their families had been close for years. But as Mark stared at the photo, something clicked in his mind. Bob had been around a lot during that time, always willing to help, always present at family events. A sudden, horrifying thought crossed his mind. Could Bob be the man behind the affair? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mark decided to do something he never thought he would have to do. One day, while Linda was out, he took hair samples from Emma and Jake's brushes and sent them off for DNA testing. It was a drastic step, one that made him feel guilty, but he had to know the truth. The results came back 2 weeks later, and Mark's world crumbled in an instant. Neither Emma nor Jake were his biological children. He had been raising another man's children, unknowingly living a lie for nearly 2 decades. The betrayal hit him like a freight train, knocking the air out of his lungs. His hands trembled as he held the DNA results, the paper a physical manifestation of the destruction of his family. Mark confronted Linda that same night. He waited for her to come home, sitting in silence with the DNA test results on the table in front of him. When she walked through the door, her cheerful greeting quickly faded when she saw the look on his face. "We need to talk," Mark said, his voice cold and detached. Linda froze, her eyes flickering to the papers on the table. "What's going on, Mark?" she asked, her tone hesitant. "I know everything," Mark replied, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "I know that Emma and Jake aren't mine. I know about the affair." For a moment, Linda said nothing. Then her face crumpled as tears began to fall. "It was a mistake, Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." Mark felt a surge of rage rise within him. "It just happened? You lied to me for years. You let me believe those kids were mine. You let me build my entire life around this family, and it was all based on a lie." Linda sobbed, trying to explain, but Mark wasn't listening anymore. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. His mind was spinning, consumed by the thought that the life he had built was nothing more than a facade. Just then, Emma, who had been upstairs, overheard the argument and stormed into the room. "What's going on?" she demanded, her eyes wide with fear. Mark, his heart breaking all over again, tried to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. Emma, always fiercely protective of her mother, turned on him in an instant. "If you break up this family because of something Mom did years ago, then you're not my dad anymore," she screamed, her voice full of venom. Those words cut deeper than anything else. In that moment, Mark realized that his relationship with his children, the people he had loved and raised, might never be the same again. He had been betrayed not just by Linda, but by the very foundation of his family. The following days were a blur of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Mark moved out of the house, leaving Linda and the kids behind. He couldn't look at them the same way anymore. The pain was too great, the betrayal too overwhelming. Linda's pleas for forgiveness fell on deaf ears as Mark initiated divorce proceedings. He pressed charges against her for fraud, feeling that she needed to face consequences for the years of deception. The once perfect family had fallen apart, and Mark's world was forever changed. As he packed up his belongings and walked out of the house that had once been his sanctuary, he knew that the road ahead would be long and painful. But one thing was clear: the life he had known was over, and there was no going back. This was just the beginning of his journey for justice, and he was willing to go as far as necessary to make sure that everyone who had betrayed him would face the consequences. Mark Thompson had always prided himself on being a rational, level-headed man. But after uncovering the devastating betrayal that shattered his life, he found himself consumed by a deep, festering rage. The kind of rage that doesn't just fade with time. It lingers, transforming into something far darker. A thirst for revenge. He had lost his wife, his family, and even his own sense of identity. But one thing he still had was control over how he could make them pay. When Mark walked away from Linda and the children, it wasn't just to escape the suffocating pain. It was to plan to prepare for what came next. Divorce wasn't enough. A simple legal separation and custody arrangement felt like a slap on the wrist for the years of deceit he had suffered. He wanted Linda and Bob, the man who had secretly fathered Emma and Jake, his so-called best friend, to feel the same ruin he did. In the months following the separation, Mark immersed himself in his work, but his mind was always somewhere else. His colleagues at the architecture firm noticed the shift in his demeanor. Once sociable and easygoing, Mark became distant, robotic even. He still produced excellent work, but it was clear his heart wasn't in it anymore. His mind was on Linda, on the lies, on the DNA results that had obliterated the life he thought he had. Mark moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the house he had shared with Linda and the kids. He wanted no reminders of that life. The apartment was modest, barely furnished, and sparsely decorated. He had no interest in making it a home. It was simply a place to sleep, a temporary shelter, while he figured out his next move. His nights were filled with restless dreams, where memories of happier times mixed with images of betrayal, leaving him feeling hollow and more determined each morning. But revenge wasn't just about Linda anymore. Mark's thoughts frequently turned to Bob, the man who had not only betrayed their friendship, but had also fathered the children Mark had raised as his own. Bob had vanished after the confrontation, retreating to his life in a neighboring town with his own family. For years, Bob had been Mark's closest friend, someone he trusted like a brother. Now he was nothing more than a symbol of everything that had been stolen from him. One evening, a few months after the divorce papers had been filed, Mark decided to track Bob down. He hadn't heard from him since the revelation, and that silence infuriated Mark even more. How could Bob just disappear? Did he feel no guilt? No shame? Mark couldn't let that stand. He needed to understand why Bob had done it, and more importantly, he needed to make Bob pay for his betrayal. Through mutual acquaintances and a bit of online digging, Mark discovered that Bob was still living in the same town, working as a high-level executive at a tech company. He had a family of his own, a wife and 2 kids. The thought of Bob living happily with his family while Mark's life had been obliterated was unbearable. He couldn't let Bob get away with it, not after what he had done. It wasn't enough for Mark to confront Bob. Words wouldn't suffice. Bob needed to feel the same sense of loss, the same devastation that had consumed Mark. So Mark began a meticulous campaign of destruction, leveraging his intelligence and resources to dismantle Bob's life piece by piece. The first step was finding out more about Bob's professional life. Mark used his connections in the business world to quietly gather information about Bob's company. It didn't take long to uncover some troubling financial inconsistencies. Bob had been involved in several shady deals over the years, using his position to funnel money into questionable ventures. Armed with this information, Mark knew he had what he needed to begin his attack. Mark anonymously compiled a dossier on Bob's illicit activities and sent it to the company's board of directors. The evidence was damning. Within weeks, Bob was called into a disciplinary meeting, and shortly after, he was fired from his high-paying job. It was a small victory, but it was only the beginning. The next target was Bob's personal life. Through social media and other sources, Mark discovered that Bob's marriage was already on shaky ground. His wife, Karen, had always been suspicious of Bob's friendship with Linda, and although she hadn't known about the affair, she had sensed something was off for years. Mark knew that planting a few well-timed seeds of doubt could push their marriage to the breaking point. He sent Karen an anonymous letter carefully crafted to reveal the affair between Bob and Linda without exposing Mark's identity. He included details only someone close to the situation would know, things that would convince her it was true. The letter was delivered directly to her work, ensuring that she had time to digest the information before confronting Bob. The fallout was immediate. Bob's marriage imploded, with Karen filing for divorce just weeks after receiving the letter. She took the kids and left, leaving Bob to grapple with a double blow of losing both his job and his family. Mark reveled in the knowledge that Bob was now suffering, that the man who had once been his friend was now feeling the same devastation he had caused. But Mark wasn't done yet. There was one more piece of his revenge left: Linda. After the divorce, Linda had moved back into the family home with the kids, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Emma and Jake. She had been devastated by Mark's decision to cut her out of his life so completely, and despite her pleas for forgiveness, he had refused any contact beyond the necessary legal proceedings. Mark's final act of revenge wasn't as overt as his takedown of Bob, but it was far more personal. He knew that the legal battle for custody of Emma and Jake would be bitter, but he didn't care. He wanted full custody, even though a part of him knew he might not win. Emma had already made it clear that she blamed him for breaking up the family, and Jake had followed her lead, distancing himself from Mark. But Mark didn't care about the outcome. He cared about the fight. He wanted to drag Linda through the courts, to make her suffer through every grueling step of the process, to force her to confront the consequences of her actions in the most public and humiliating way possible. The custody battle became a media spectacle, with friends, family, and even the local community taking sides. Linda's reputation was tarnished, her name whispered in gossip circles as the woman who had destroyed her family with her infidelity. Mark hired the best lawyers, determined to drag the proceedings out for as long as possible. It wasn't about winning custody. It was about making Linda feel the weight of her betrayal every day they were in court. In the end, Mark didn't win full custody. The judge granted joint custody, with the children spending time between both households. But for Mark, the outcome was irrelevant. He had succeeded in making Linda's life miserable, forcing her to live with the consequences of her choices in the most painful way possible. Despite the destruction he had caused, Mark felt no relief. The rage that had driven him for so long still burned within him, but now it was accompanied by an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He had dismantled the lives of the people who had betrayed him, but at what cost? His own life was in ruins. His relationships with Emma and Jake were strained, perhaps irreparably, and he had become a man defined by bitterness and revenge. It wasn't until one fateful day, nearly 5 years after the initial discovery of the affair, that Mark's carefully constructed plan of revenge came to a head in the most unexpected way. It had been 5 years since Mark had walked out of his old life and begun his quest for retribution. In that time, he had barely seen Emma or Jake. The once tight bond he had shared with them had frayed, and they had chosen to stay with Linda after the divorce. Occasionally, they would visit on holidays or birthdays, but the visits were brief and awkward, filled with tension and resentment. One evening, as Mark sat in his apartment, now slightly more furnished but still cold and impersonal, there was a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and when he opened it, he was shocked to see Emma standing there, looking older and more mature than he remembered. "Dad," she said, her voice hesitant but determined. "I need to talk to you." Mark hadn't seen Emma in over a year. She had gone off to college and had barely kept in touch. He stepped aside, letting her in, unsure of what to expect. "I need money," she said bluntly, her eyes not meeting his. "For school. Things are tight, and Mom can't cover everything. I thought maybe you could help." For a moment, Mark felt a pang of the love he had once felt for her. Despite everything, she was still his daughter in every way that mattered, at least that's what he had told himself for years. But then the bitterness rose up again, reminding him of the betrayal, of the years of lies he had lived through. He looked at her, his expression cold and distant. "Do you know the truth, Emma? About why I left? About who your real father is?" Emma blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I know," she said quietly, "but that doesn't change anything. You're still my dad." Mark shook his head, feeling the weight of everything that had happened between them. He reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope, the DNA test results he had received all those years ago. He handed it to her. The quiet of Mark's apartment was suddenly shattered by the sound of the doorbell. Mark opened the door to find Emma standing there, looking as if she had walked straight out of a difficult dream. Her face, once so familiar and beloved, now seemed distant and strained, mirroring the fractures in their relationship. She was no longer the little girl he had raised, but a young woman grappling with the complexities of adulthood. Mark's heart ached seeing her, but he had long since steeled himself against these feelings. His life had become a cycle of calculated revenge and emotional numbness. Even now, seeing Emma, his own flesh and blood, did little to soften the hardened shell he had built around himself. He invited her in, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could happen next. Emma stepped into the apartment, glancing around the sparse, almost sterile environment. The place lacked any personal touch, a stark contrast to the home she had known. The awkward silence that followed was filled with unspoken tension. Mark motioned for her to sit, and they both took their places on opposite sides of the small dining table, the space between them feeling like an expanse that no words could bridge. "I need money for college," Emma said, her voice wavering but resolute. "Things are getting tough, and Mom's struggling to cover all the expenses. I thought maybe you could help." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected this request, but the reality of it was still jarring. He knew it wasn't just about money. Emma was reaching out, perhaps hoping to mend a relationship that had been shattered by years of deceit and emotional fallout. The bitter irony was not lost on him. She wanted his help, but there was so much more that needed to be addressed, so much pain that had yet to be confronted. Instead of responding immediately, Mark took a deep breath and walked over to his desk. He retrieved the envelope containing the DNA results, the same results that had exposed the truth about Emma and Jake's parentage. He placed the envelope in front of Emma, who looked at it with confusion. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. "Open it," Mark said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Read it for yourself." Emma hesitated for a moment before carefully tearing open the envelope. As she unfolded the papers inside, her expression shifted from confusion to shock. The results were clear, confirming what Mark had known for years. Emma and Jake were not his biological children. The truth that had been buried under years of denial and pretense was now laid bare before her. Emma's hands trembled as she read the results. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Mark, searching for an explanation. "Why? Why are you doing this now?" Mark felt a pang of sympathy, but quickly buried it under layers of hardened resolve. "Because you need to understand the full picture," he said. "I didn't just leave because of the affair. I left because I was deceived, betrayed in the most profound way. I thought you were mine. I raised you as my own, and then I found out it was all a lie." Emma's face crumpled as the realization hit her. "You think this is fair?" she cried. "That you get to decide that I'm not your daughter anymore just because of a test?" Mark's heart ached as he saw the hurt in her eyes, but he remained steadfast. "It's not about fairness. It's about the truth. And the truth is, I can't be part of your life the way I was before. Not after everything that's happened." Emma's tears flowed freely now, her voice choked with emotion. "Dad, please. I know things have been hard between us, but I need you. I need your support. I'm trying to build a future, and I don't have anyone else to turn to." Mark's eyes softened momentarily, but he quickly steeled himself again. "If you need money for college, you should ask Bob. He's your real father after all." Emma's eyes widened in shock and confusion. "What do you mean, Bob? Uncle Bob?" "Yes," Mark said coldly. "Bob was your real father. He's the one who should be responsible for you." Emma's face paled as the full weight of Mark's words sank in. "You can't be serious. Why would you do this? Why would you send me to him?" Mark stood up and walked towards the door. "Because it's the truth, and because you need to understand that your life isn't as simple as you thought it was. I'm done being a part of this charade." Emma reached out desperately as Mark moved to close the door. "Dad, please, don't do this. I'm begging you. I don't know what to do." Mark's resolve wavered for just a moment, but he shook his head, his expression set in a grim line. "I can't help you anymore, Emma. I've done everything I could to make them pay. Now it's time for you to face the reality of the situation." With that, Mark closed the door, the sound echoing through the apartment like a final irrevocable act. He stood on the other side, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He had pushed Emma away, sent her to face the consequences of the life he had helped to create. He had finally exacted his revenge on Linda and Bob. But what cost? Outside the door, Emma sank to the floor, her sobs mingling with the distant sounds of the city. Her world had been turned upside down once again. The man she had always called Dad was now a stranger, and she was left to grapple with the devastating reality of her biological father and the shattered remnants of her once stable life. Over the next few weeks, Mark tried to return to a semblance of normalcy. He threw himself into his work, seeking refuge in the routines that had once provided him comfort, but the victory he had sought felt hollow. He had achieved his revenge, but it had come at the expense of the relationships he had once cherished. He continued to follow the news of Emma and Bob from a distance, learning that Bob had been struggling to rebuild his life after the scandal and divorce. Karen had taken the children and moved away, leaving Bob to face the fallout of his actions alone. Emma had reluctantly reached out to Bob, who was trying to offer her some support, but their relationship was strained and filled with the same bitterness that had characterized Mark's interactions with Linda. As the months passed, Mark found himself reflecting on the cost of his actions. He had sacrificed his happiness and his relationships in the pursuit of revenge. The family he had once held dear was now scattered and broken, and the emptiness he felt seemed to deepen with each passing day. Mark's quest for retribution had brought about the justice he sought, but it had also left him grappling with the consequences of his choices. He had taken down the people who had wronged him, but in doing so, he had lost a part of himself that he could never regain. In the end, Mark found himself standing at a crossroads, facing the reality that revenge had come at a greater cost than he could have ever anticipated. The life he had fought so hard to reconstruct was one of isolation and regret, a reminder that even the most well-planned acts of retribution could not undo the damage of betrayal or heal the wounds left behind. As he looked out over the city from his apartment window, Mark realized that his quest for justice had left him with little more than the echoes of a shattered past. The path to healing would be long and uncertain, and for the first time in years, Mark faced the daunting challenge of finding a way to move forward, not with revenge, but with the hope of rebuilding a semblance of peace in his fractured life.